I'm Heather Armstrong, Executive Director of Recycle Florida today, and I'd like to welcome our two speakers, Will Sagar, Executive Director of the Southeast Recycling Development Council, and Wayne Gjerde, Board Member at the National Recycling Coalition, Recycling Market Development Coordinator, State of Minnesota. And a special thank you to our moderator, one of our moderators, Jean Dobbs, Director of Outreach at SERDC. But before we move on, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about our two speakers today. We have Will. Again, Will is the Executive Director for the Southeast Recycling Development Council. SERDC's mission is to unite industry, government, and non-government organizations to promote sustainable recycling in the Southeast. Efforts include a specific focus on the environment, on the economic impact of the recycling industry. And Wayne is the Recycling Market Development Coordinator with the Environmental Economic Development Unit, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Wayne consults with startups and expanding companies in the areas of finance, new product development, business plan development, sales, and marketing. Wayne has also done extensive work in economic analysis linking the environment and economy. Wayne has also been a speaker at many local and national recycling events. Thank you, Wayne and Will. Thank you for joining us this morning. But before we introduce Will, who will be our first speaker, I'd like to take a moment just to give a few housekeeping notes. As an attendee, you are in listen-only mode. You can ask any questions you'd like during the webinar. If you look to the right hand of your screen, you should see a panel box. There's a link there that says questions. You can type them in there, and we're able to see them. We'll take them at the end of the discussion. And also, this webinar is being recorded, and you will have access to it post-event. With that, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Will.
Thank you, Heather. Good morning to all of you out there. It is my pleasure to be with you today. If we could go through the sponsor slide into the next slide. These are the sponsors that support SERDC. And we work to expand recycling across the Southeast and hopefully that ultimately across the country. Next slide, please. We're talking about market development today, and Wayne's going to look at efforts that they've done to improve the demand for materials. SERDC's efforts are largely to improve the supply side of recycling. The Southeast is home to many of the manufacturers that consume recycled material, and I'll get into some of that during this slide deck. But the manufacturers like the Southeast for many reasons, but our programs in many of our local governments across the South, particularly in our rural areas, are not performing well, and we're not able to feed the local and regional supply that we have, so our demand that we have, so we have to focus on the supply. So in this presentation, I will cover just what SERDC is doing and what some of the individual states across the region are doing to improve supply. We've quantified our demand in a study that we released almost a year ago, end of last year, where we identified 360 manufacturing facilities across the Southeast that are reliant either wholly or in large part on the recycling materials coming from our curbside and drop-off programs. These manufacturing facilities have 90,000 employees. These are employees in manufacturing jobs. This is the holy grail for the economic development community. So we want to highlight that and communicate that message of the importance that we have there. There's over $40 billion, that's $1 billion of economic impact coming from here, but then our work is how do we get the material to feed that? Because indeed, some of these commodities are looking at that they're at the capacity for what feedstock they've got, and we need to expand that feedstock. This map is on the SERDC website, and you can sort by state, you can sort by material type to drill in, and each one of those dots has a pop-up to explain the company, and with that it has their website, the commodities they are consuming, the products they're putting out, and the specific economic information for that site. In addition to that overall demand impact mapping tool that we've done some specific work in some of our states, particularly most recently early this year in Tennessee. We studied the full economic impact, not just the manufacturing demand, but also we looked at the processors, the haulers, the collection community, everybody involved in recycling there. I mean, we already had identified 39 manufacturers and 7,000 jobs in manufacturing. But if we look at the full impact across Tennessee, there's a typo slide. This is the Tennessee data. There's 66,000 jobs and $17 billion of activity. This is not just the direct jobs or the direct economic activity. The jobs are the jobs in and around all the businesses related to recycling. But those jobs are then supported by the indirect jobs, those jobs where the people supplying equipment or supplies to a material recovery facility or to the manufacturer, those jobs that are supporting the industry itself, but not necessarily recycling jobs. And then there's those payrolls to all of the direct and indirect jobs. Those payrolls are then circulated throughout the state when they're paid, and they create more jobs when you go to the grocery store, when you go to the movies. That's the induced impact. And so the total of the induced, the direct, and indirect, we come up with a $17 billion economic impact and almost $500 million of state taxes available. These same studies with similar results have been conducted in South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, and in North Carolina, somewhat of a different, but we're seeing just tremendous numbers of the economic impact that recycling is having in our region. And we want to bring that to expand that and to keep that supported, because it's an important part of our economy. We've known for decades that recycling is good for the environment, but it's just increasingly present that this is important for our economy, and we need to drive that. But as we look at markets that we're having and all that, how do we make this work? And so SERDC is now advocating for some best practices that we can have to, the best practices that we can get so that we can move the material to market efficiently and have the highest participation rate at the lowest cost that we can get. And we're looking at getting single stream collection, particularly single stream in carts for curbside, but also to bring single stream to our drop-off centers, our convenience centers, and we're seeing some significant cost reduction when convenience centers convert to single stream. SERDC's working to advocate for a common suite of materials. I know, Heather, you've got some work going on in Florida to establish a statewide program for back to basics or to communicate so that we all know what goes into the recycling bin. There's quite a bit of work to be done there. SERDC's working closely with state agencies across the region to help develop the outreach, the messaging, so we can get some branding for recycling that will promulgate and people will have it on their minds more. And also to provide some support, particularly for the smaller local governments, where the recycling coordinator may also be the animal control officer or the landfill operator or the transfer station manager, and doesn't really have the tools for graphic designs and that they need to do to get their message. And we're working with the states so that the state can provide them ready to use outreach material. We're working on improving data measurement, helping states with reporting mechanisms, and we're working on state-by-state reporting, and to the point of where we're going to have a conference in February because we need good data so that if we don't measure what we're doing, we can't. And lastly, SERDC is advocating that we really look seriously at moving to a hub and spoke system where we have large, high volume, high capacity automated MRFs doing most of the sorting of this single stream. The small 1 and 2 ton an hour MRFs are really going to be dinosaurs before long, because they can't compete with the large ones. Looking at some of the outreach in the specific states, North Carolina has got 3 different campaigns that they're using. The Recycle More is focused to reach the households. The Re3 is a recycling promotion really aimed at the millennials, and it's got a whole library of graphics and outreach materials that are there on their website to get to the millennials. The Recycle Guides were developed by DHEC in South Carolina. North Carolina and several other states are using the Recycle Guides, but that's to get the children for their recycling promotion. The North Carolina DEQ has also done quite a bit of work to measure the economic impact in North Carolina, where they've counted job growth or counted the number of jobs in the industry several times over the last 23 years. And what's really remarkable is to look at what happened between 2008 and 2010 to 2013. This is the period when our economy was on its knees. Unemployment rate in North Carolina was in 2009 was at 10%. But the recycling industry, just because of the efficiency we have and the cost savings in using recycled content, this industry managed to continue to grow. We were just quietly adding jobs because there's a solid foundation for the concept of using our materials again in manufacturing. The most recent study does show a drop in jobs. It's not really that the industry contracted in North Carolina at that time, but the DEQ's office changed their formula for where several of our manufacturers use recycling for part of their process, and they changed how they allocate jobs and counted them at that point. So it shows a drop there, but that was really a recalculation, and the general trend seems to be in place, and we'll look for them to repeat that study, hopefully, and support that in the future. I made brief reference to the Back to Basics campaign in Florida. Florida DEP's office is bringing together all the MRF operators, or the large MRF operators across the state, and getting on a single platform so we can communicate, so people won't go from one town to the next and see different messaging about what to put into the cart. And the problem is that if with these different messages in different towns, we're confusing people, and confused participants become disengaged. But Florida's really taking a lead role in moving this forward. In South Carolina has adopted a very aggressive goal to be at a 40% recycle rate by 2020. The Department of Commerce works with the Department of Health and Environmental Control to advance recycling. South Carolina is unique in that in the very early 90s, they created a recycling office in the Department of Commerce. I've got recycling offices in all the 11 SERDC states, and whatever the environmental agency is, there are dedicated staff to recycling. But in South Carolina, they also have that over in their economic development community. South Carolina was looking at in the early 90s, the exodus of the textile industry, which was big in South Carolina, and really that tobacco was a declining industry because there was a lot of tobacco in South Carolina. And what can they do? And they looked and they developed 5 different clusters of emphasis in the Department of Commerce, one of those being recycling. And it had tremendous results through the years by bringing that focus of recycling as an economic development tool. South Carolina did develop the Recycle Guys, and with the Department of Commerce, the Recycle Markets Development Advisory Council works as a branch of the Department of Commerce. The members of that council are appointed by the governor, and they all from the industry and from manufacturing, and they work year to year to advance recycling. In Georgia, the Georgia Recycling Coalition is putting out a lot of programming on that, and you see this is the flyer they developed this year that is putting an emphasis on how important recycling is to the Georgia economy. They do mention the environmental side, but they're bringing the, as you can see, 2/3 of that is dedicated to the economic impact. Georgia is a huge consumer of recycled material, second in the country only to California in the amount of recycling material that's consumed in their manufacturing. The carpet industry consumes so much of the PET that's collected from, they're importing it from across the whole country and beyond to feed what the carpet manufacturing in northern Georgia. Novelis has one of the largest aluminum processors in Greensboro, Georgia. And the paper industry has been solid in Georgia all along. Alabama is working on their outreach to their community. They've developed a Recycling Works for Me campaign that is videos that had airtime and billboard time across the state, and the state agencies communicating through studies that they've done that quantify that they're paying $25 million in tip fees to bury $180 million worth of economy of material that could be feeding their economy. Alabama's home to the largest plastics, or largest HDPE recycler in the entire world. Their plant is visible from the space station. It's so big where they're storing material down in Troy, Alabama. Some other efforts across the region. Louisiana has got a new head for the recycling office in their Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. There's a recycling coalition that's getting off the ground in the last 12 months in Louisiana to bring together those recycling coordinators at local government and the industries that are there to get them communicating, working, and hopefully to strengthen recycling in Louisiana. Arkansas has got significant support out of DEQ and the funding that they put into the local programs. They've got a funding mechanism that's contributing more to local governments than any state we've got in the SERDC region. Kentucky is also working to, Kentucky DEP has a well-funded grant program for local governments, and they're very focused on expanding a hub and spoke structure within Kentucky, focused on some of the larger cities they've got there. As well, then there's EPA, the Region 4 office. EPA Region 4 is 8 states in the Southeast. It's 8. SERDC is 11, but the 8 states in Region 4 are all in the SERDC region, and we've worked closely with Region 4. But Region 4 is working on advancing tools for state and local governments for planning and the management, especially measurement. Region 4 has taken a leadership role for the whole country in advancing the measurement of waste disposal and recycling. They've got an ongoing curriculum for advancing the infrastructure and programs in the region. And they have some funding out that has been there to advance recycling study and the understanding and the communication of this economic impact back to the elected decision makers at the state and local level. So Region 4 has been a tremendous partner for us and for recycling in the Southeast. I'll close with just a blatant plug for two events we've got coming. We're having our annual meeting early next month in Asheville, North Carolina. And I've made all this mentions to measurement. Our country has got a lot of work to do in advancing the measurement of waste disposal, recycling capture, where is our material, how much are we managing, and how can we get onto some similar platforms so that our reporting starts to make sense and we can then see and measure how we're doing and set some benchmarks for how we move forward. But that meeting will happen in Chattanooga or at the end of February next year. And with that, my last slide is just contact information. I think if you've signed up for this, you've already found that contact information. But Jen and I are certainly available to take any questions you have today or down the road. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, excellent presentation, Will, and thank you for sharing all of that information, especially some of those slides were really interesting about the economic impact that our industry has and also the social marketing pieces. But I want to remind everyone, feel free to, if you have any questions for Will or Wayne, type them in. We will take them at the end. Now we will prepare to hear from Wayne, and Wayne is going to share some information about recycling market development in the 21st century. Hi, Wayne, welcome.
Thank you. So, good morning. My name's Wayne Gjerde, and I work as the recycling market development person in the state of Minnesota here. So I've been doing this for about 20 years. And what you see on the screen is Paul Bunyan. We do something called the Eco Experience every year, and we talk about recycling. In this case, we're talking about textiles, but we talk about a variety of things, and we look at all portions of the waste stream. So next slide. So some of you may have heard the term sustainable materials management, and and saw this thing, and it looks, you'll see in the next slide, we're talking about circular economy type of things, which in some ways is old, in some ways it's new in terms of the way we look at it, but recycling market development is a very important part of that process as we look forward to the future. And next slide. And here's another look at a circular economy. I was at a conference yesterday where I'll call this gentleman a futurist, but he was talking about supply of materials and people and food and really this principle of the circular economy, highest and best use where nothing is wasted, is going to be very important as we move forward to 2050 and 9 billion people. So next slide. So why spend money? And you saw in Will's slides that there was increased interest and increased money going into recycling market development. Well, why? It's about the jobs. So, but we've spent a long time. North Carolina, our state of Minnesota, and others back in '96 put out the first economic development analysis talking about why it's good for the economy, it's good for the environment. And here's a lot of times, and not so much anymore, but it's kind of one of those things. It's kind of like selling Coke or Coca-Cola, or pop, depending on what region the country you're in. You got to continue to tell people it's good for the environment, it's good for the economy. It creates domestic jobs, which are important, saves energy, reduces greenhouse gases, depending on what you're talking about. And in particular, since I did this presentation, or I should say it's getting more interesting, if anybody has heard of China sword and some of the 3 through 7 bans of plastic and what's going on in mixed paper, that those domestic jobs and those domestic capacity are becoming ever more important, which we can control that. And the great thing is it creates local economic development. Our philosophy here in Minnesota since 1998 is even if we're exporting material, we want to export something of value. So I always like to say, don't throw away jobs. And I think there was the Alabama slide, if I'm not mistaken, there that said they spent $25 million throwing away a $200 million worth of materials. We did this. We are fortunate to have fairly decent data, but you can kind of see that we threw away $2.3 billion worth of recycled materials between 96 and 2013. So those materials could have been used to create economic wealth and economic value, both in the state of Minnesota and across the country, because we do ship some of our material to KW in Alabama, and some of our PET obviously goes to those carpet mills in Georgia. So I helped, as you saw in the background, kind of do a similar thing based on the EPA, and you can see, in 2012 we threw away $12 billion worth of stuff just in 1 year. So think about, so the next time somebody, your colleague, your boss, your whatever, or if you're talking to the media, you say, every time you throw away something, you throw away a job. Next slide. So what are we doing in Minnesota? And that's our state capitol there with our, which we just remodeled that. That building was built in 1905, and they just spent $100 million on that. But it's a good example of refurbishing and reusing, which are part of the hierarchy. But next slide. So we are looking at, a lot of the traditional market development has been, well, okay, let's do glass to glass, or bottles to bottles, or paper to paper. We have had this philosophy of highest and best use, and we're really now starting to look at, particularly in the paper, we're doing some projects of, do we have to make paper out of paper, or can we look at that paper as cellulose and say, well, what can we make out of cellulose? And so we have a couple projects going. One in particular, as we're looking at using that to make a solid surface countertop, if you will, but more in the commercial area, where if your desktop is laminate or something, that this would be a replacement for that. Plastic, obviously, we've been at that for a while, looking at plastic lumber. One other project in the paper, is looking actually at replacing a plastic product in terms of a freezer to oven ready, leak-proof, compostable container. So when you're at the sports stadium and you have that greasy hot dog or fries or whatever, and you don't want it to drip on your lap, and right now that boat you have is plastic coated, which is kind of hard to recycle. Well, it actually doesn't get into the recycling stream because it's too contaminated. So the next best thing is to put it in the organic stream and compost that. So that's a product under development. Glass. Can we use that as a lightweight aggregate? There's some foam glass products we're looking at that we can look at instead of using, if you're going through, right now, the technology, if you're going through a soft spot, and if you're building the road, you use wood chips. Well, wood chips deteriorate, and they also release tannins, which can contaminate groundwater. This would be an inert product that you could use in the roadways. You can use it on the roofs to collect water, so you can reduce your footprint of your stormwater ponds and increase the footprint of your building. So the bigger building you can build on your footprint, the better off you are. So, excuse me. And metals, we're looking at a variety of products. Just strengthening. Can we strengthen the infrastructure we have? But it's all about looking at this material and say, what can we do with it? Do we have to go the traditional way? How can we get to the highest value for that material? And so the reason for doing that, and getting back to some of what Will says, is that if we're going to pull these materials into the stream to make something, we have to have the products that have the ability to pay the freight. And so they can't be a very low value material that the product user is not willing to pay that much money for. We have, there's a standard, and generally that's $100 to $200. If you're at $200 a ton or more, but 100 tons is kind of the standard there. If you need to be above that. So next slide. So again, how do we finance these projects? And we've talked about in this day and age, and Minnesota is not immune to this, of lack of funding in terms of supporting some of these projects. And that's been difficult now. In looks like in Will's area, they're investing some money. So are there some ways that we can do a national financing scheme? There's some examples out there right now of the closed loop fund. Obviously, there's public financing, there's private financing, there's industry support, and so I've proposed in the past. People have talked about, in the case of closed loop fund, they raised $100 million. I think we need to raise $1 billion. And so then the question is, how do we pay for those bonds? In particular now, with, again, getting back to the China sword, maybe we can reanimate some of these factories. And maybe they were making paper before, but maybe they're making another paper-like product. So, or they're making steel, or they're making something out of plastic, or they're doing biorefining, or doing something with the material. But if you look at that, that's not that much money per state. I think it's a little over $20 million. We need to make that next push in terms of really investing in the industry. Particularly, this will allow us to not only support the programs where people are putting that in, but also, of course, support domestic jobs, and of course, they pay taxes and support infrastructure. So, next slide. So that brings us to the end of our just about to the end here. I just wanted to talk just a little bit about go back a little bit about that Alabama slide. I think every state should have that. And there was one stat that I wanted to put out there. Minnesota, I would say we're very generous. Once a landfill is closed, we take responsibility at the state level for closed landfills. And so we started that program in 1994. So since 1994, we have spent $455 million on our closed landfill program. Now, just think of that. That is halfway there to that $1 billion in terms of maybe it would been nice if we could have invested that $450 million in end market development and collection and stuff like that. So, the moral of the story is, once that material goes in the hole, and I'll call it a hole, and I think that's an appropriate term for it, because it's a black hole in terms of money, and that material ceases to produce economic activity. So with that, I think that's all I have to say. And if there's any questions, I guess we're ready for that, right?
Yes, we are. And thank you, Lane, again for just sharing all of that information with us. And so with that, we will open up the question portion of this webinar. And we do have a few questions from our audience. And I'll just throw it out there to both of you, and whoever would like to answer, feel free. This is a question from our audience member. With the Chinese export situation, do you see domestic processing and utilization increasing? And if so, where and how long do you feel that would take to develop?
I'll go first on that. As a newly elected board member, NRC, and there was a call here actually last week or 2 weeks ago. We talked about a recycling market development task force, specifically addressing that. Now, how long does this take? It's not a fast process. So the fastest process is, of course, if you have something that's already there and you can reanimate that. But I think we're looking into 2018. We're working on some projects in Minnesota, but it's not a fast process. And as we move forward with this market development task force, I will say anybody, there'll be some information going out that anybody that wants to join that in terms of organizations or become part of that will be convening shortly. I'm not exactly that. It's kind of in the organization stages. So that's a rather long answer to it. So, Will, I don't know what you have to say about that.
Well, I would give a short answer is yes. I think it is going to create an opportunity for some capacity expansion domestically. But the longer answer is I think while this is getting a lot of media coverage within our industry, at least at this point, and it is causing some turmoil in market prices, particularly for fiber right now, the sky's not falling. Remember 4 years ago, we had the green fence, and there was a lot of concern and panic about where is the future, but we were able to absorb all that, and life continued on. And in fact, we saw in the last year some very high market prices for fiber. In fact, the drops we're seeing right now are kind of bringing us back not so far below the averages we've seen over the last several years. So we've got a very inelastic supply of material going to the market because the homeowner is disconnected from the market price. And when we have an inelastic supply, it only takes a small change in demand to give us a large price swing. Hence, we see a lot of fluctuation in prices in our markets, but that doesn't mean that the material flow is changing that significantly. So with that said, I think that's going to temper the expansion that we might see because there is already an existing demand for much of this material. And I think China's going to have to look at how they do feed facilities like Nine Dragons and others that need a lot of material. But also remember, China has been, our exports to China have been declining for the last 5-6 years. As the China economy is developing and they're becoming more affluent, they're generating now a lot of their own spent packaging to go into their systems. And we're seeing that shift happen as it is. But there'll still be a lot of international trade to go on and a lot of material moving back and forth. As this shakes out.
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing. I think the opportunity for us is to develop that, I'll call it an intermediary capacity to process material. So that would be sort and wash and turn it into resin. So, and that resin may be exported. So I think that's our opportunity there to put some additional capacity where there wasn't any before, and to improve the value of it before we ship it someplace. So.
Thank you both. Another question from the audience, and Will, I believe this one is for you. I think it goes back to one of your slides. The question is, does your analysis consider actual economic impact if you take out the recycling, if you take the recycling businesses out of the mix? And I believe it's referencing the slide on the economic impact of recycling in Tennessee about the increased economic activity, the $17.4 billion. So the question is, they're asking, do you take out, does your analysis consider the actual economic impact if you take the recycling businesses out of the mix?
In the reports, and they are on our website, for South Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama, for those states, the economic impact study there identifies the direct jobs, meaning those in the recycling industry, the indirect, which are the businesses that support it, and then the induced jobs, and all those are listed separately in those reports on our website.
Perfect, and you can visit the website. There is a slide that has the website to the SERDC website for the person who asked that question, so you should be able to find the information there. And we'll wrap up this webinar with one more question, and this is for, again, either of you. Are there any successful implementations for programs for market development?
Are there, this is Wayne from Minnesota. I would say that over the years, there's been many examples. North Carolina ourselves, California, New York, South Carolina, they've all had their niches in terms of some product that has put them on the map. Ohio, plastic lumber. You know, in Minnesota, we did a project in 1994 and through 96 was when I started. It's called Renewal by Anderson. It's actually a wood plastic composite. And today, they have said if you have Anderson windows, which I think they are distributed nationally, maybe not all in your state, but they have said if it wouldn't have been for that, they would not be the company they are today. Every window that goes out, even if it has some wood in, has some wood plastic composite made from that initial grant project, and that was just $100,000. So, you know, Anderson Window is a multi-billion-dollar company. So, anyway, that's a example. So, there's a couple paper mills in our de-inking mill and a OCC mill that would not exist except for us. Other states have that example. I think North Carolina. You look at, I'm sure KW in Alabama, other states, all have examples of where a market development person or economic development person assisted in the start of that project. Plastic lumber is a good example across the whole country that would not exist except for the efforts of market development. So.
Yeah. And I would, as Wayne said, I would particularly point to South Carolina and the Department of Commerce and the creation of the Recycling Markets Development Advisory Council. We're index 25, 26 years old now, and they have had a significant impact in job growth in South Carolina. And I think the one thing I would add to that is when we talk about market development, very often it's people are wanting to see their markets locally or at least in their state. And many of our state agencies and our local governments are very state-centric, and they look at the state line as a geopolitical barrier, and they can't think across it. They've got travel restrictions and going across it, which builds on that. But you know, the material moves across the state line at 70 miles an hour, and we don't think anything of shipping material 100, 200, or 300 miles. And we look at market development. We've got to think broader than just in our backyard. The market doesn't have to be local to be a legitimate market.
You know, I think a good example of that, Will, is we did a project with MACRO, which is the Mid-America Council of Recycling States. It's 14 states. We worked on shingles to asphalt, which is a construction demolition. But I think almost every state out there, and it all started with that, realizing that it's a local material, but it can move across state lines, and it's a problem we all have. So, and I think that's a really great example of a material that regionally we understood that it didn't make any difference if it was in Minnesota, Wisconsin, or Iowa, or whatever, that we all needed to solve this problem. And you know, it's today's shingles probably aren't as prominent in use because of the low oil prices, but you know, that's not going to be that way forever. But it did establish a baseline and that model for cooperation across state lines.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for joining us today, and to everyone who joined the webinar. You will receive information and a follow-up survey. Please take a few moments to take that. I'd like to again give a special thank you to Will, Wayne, and Jennifer. And again, I'm Heather Armstrong, Executive Director of Recycle Florida today, and I invite you to join us for our 2018 Joint Summit, January 28th through 30th in Lake Buena Vista, Florida. I hope to see everyone soon, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.